Welcome to one more edition of Politics Done Right. Today, we are honored once again to have with us the one and only Dr. Andy Bard. Who's Dr. Andy Bard? Of course, a prize-winning author, former Democratic candidate for Congress in Virginia's very red Shenandoah Valley, former talk show host, summa cum laude graduate from Harvard, so we know he's smart, awarded with distinction in a program specifically created to accommodate his original theory explaining how civilization has developed, and a frequent columnist in newspapers throughout the United States, Mr. Dr. Schmookler. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing fine. Glad to be back with you.
Well, absolutely. So today we're going to discuss an article some may think they have a notion of, because even I told you the article is titled, "How Are We to Think of Human Nature?" To which I responded, nurture versus nature. And then you said, let's take it a little bit deeper. So, Dr. Schmookler, tell me about human nature.
Well, should I start with those two straw men or should I go right to my thesis?
My brother, it's
okay.
On you.
All right. So you mentioned that I have this original theory about what's happened to us as a species since we became civilized and took an unprecedented step. Well, that's true, and it has had at the center of it has been the question of human nature. So I got hit by that idea in 1970. I went in to see what everybody was saying about human nature because that was at the center of my vision. And I found that I really didn't agree with some of the main things that are out there in our civilization. One was the idea that we didn't have a real human nature, that we are so plastic that culture can make of us anything it wants, and like that. And I rejected that because we evolved to be creatures who lived like primates, and then hominids, and then hunter-gatherer bands of Homo sapiens for hundreds of thousands of years. We had to have a nature then. How could we not have one now? Just because we're cultural, because hunter-gatherers were living in a way that was consistent with what we had done before, and all creatures have to have an inborn
Doctor,
nature.
let me stop you for a second here, because a lot of folks that are listening won't necessarily understand what you mean by we were hunter-gatherers. So why don't you give us a slight explanation of what that means?
Oh, well, interesting. That's been so fundamental to how I think. I forget that not everybody's thought that way. But until 10,000 years ago, all of Homo sapiens, our species, were living as what's called hunter-gatherers, which is they live off of what nature spontaneously provides.
As opposed to?
Well, as opposed to what then came, we started inventing a new way of life, and that begins with the domestication of plants and animals. The animals that people used to hunt, they start to gather into pens. And the plants that the gatherers used to gather, people start to cultivate in their own gardens. And this is an enormously significant event in the history of life. I mean, 3.5 billion years, never had a species done what we did then, which is invent a new way of life. And so it's a gradual emergence. Of course, we had a nature, and why would it go away? Well, you can say, well, for 10,000 years, we've been doing something different from what we'd always done, but that's just a drop in the bucket, 10,000 years after, mammalian evolution for 100 million years, or how that's the dryer. Sorry about that. Anyway, it was obvious that we would still have a substantial and important human nature, which equipped us to be able to do what we had to do when we lived in that other circumstance that we emerged out of over tens or hundreds of millions of years, however you want to think of it. And then there are the other people who would look at human nature and they would say, we're territorial animals. We're inherently willing to use violence to get what we want. And you can notice whenever anybody in our culture says, well, that's human nature, I think virtually without exception, when somebody says, well, that's human nature, they're pointing to something negative. So the heart of my vision about what's happened to us as a species could be boiled down to the statement that we've discussed before, that the ugliness we see in human history is not a clear window into our human nature. So I disagreed with the people who said we had no nature, and I disagreed with the people who said that we should look at our nature as basically problematic.
And you know, it's interesting because I think that can be expanded into a lot of different arenas. Right now, we're talking about civilization, human nature, and what is it intrinsic to us that that makes us do what we do. But many a times when we're talking about just regular policies that we come up with, a lot of the excuses generally made on the right is that sounds good. That sounds like something nice to do, but it's not what, again, Dr. Schmookler, it's not human nature, and therefore we don't do. Continue, please. Kind of expand
one of
on
the
that.
places where you and I have joined, I believe, and why I appreciate your having me back to deliver my better human story. But I think I understand that part of the appeal of a better human story for you is that you have a vision that we are capable of making a society that is far better than what we've got now.
Absolutely.
And so it's a value from your point of view, as it is from mine, to be able to see that what we are seeing around us shouldn't be understood as a clear window into this is what we are. We could be a lot better. And so the heart of this piece, to move into the next phase, is to answer the question, well, if I'm right in my vision, which we're not getting into today, but have in the past, which says that any species that steps across the line into civilization is going to get swept up into a systemic force that unnaturally drives the civilization to develop in destructive ways. And I feel like I proved that, but that's not where we're going now. Where we're going now is assuming that such a systemic force has driven the development of civilization in ways that we could not avoid and did not choose. Assuming that, how are we to understand what we're seeing in relation to, well, what is our nature? And that leads me to tell the story about some research from the 1950s involving
before you go into the
monkeys.
research, because that was a good research, the one that you talk about, the monkeys that had two different ways of being raised. I enjoyed that story, but I want to, before we get to the research itself, move it a bit more into today's reality, because how it is that we, America as a country, many a times had found itself on a path to redemption and on a path to correct its past ills, on a path that says we are better than that. How do we then, if there isn't something within ourselves that want to be quote unquote bad, and you know, I'm just using that as an excuse.
That's fine.
How do we allow, using your terminology again, the gangster, how do we allow the gangster to move us back into a position that really is rather inhumane and what we would like to call not human nature, but societal maybe?
Well, so if somebody's willing to grant me that there's a force that's not a function of human nature that has driven our civilization, considered as a whole, system that's been, globally developing for 10,000 years, and, takes the forms of individual societies and cultures, and it takes the form of the whole pattern in which empires get built by powerful societies incorporating weaker societies. If you're willing to just sort of stipulate for the moment that you step across this threshold into civilization, and boom, you're in this war of all against all, and all kinds of crap's going to happen, no matter what the nature of the creature. If you stipulate that, then you're going to say, well, look at, and we've discussed this too, how patterns of brokenness move through history, move through time. You've got, and part of the thing is that you've got people who are broken in various ways. They've been raised in family structures that are injurious, that are the fruit of all that crap that's been going on. So, for example, I'm writing a piece right now about what is it that makes people susceptible to believing lies. Because, as a guy, I've been a truth teller. I mean, I'm all about finding the truth and telling the truth. And I'm just blown away by what I've witnessed. We've got tens of millions of people in this country who believe, and we could make a little list of really important beliefs that they believe to be true, and whose falsehood is just couldn't be more obvious. The stolen election lie, the Trump did nothing wrong lie, the climate change is a hoax lie. I mean, there's no way anybody with basic intelligence and who is reasonably open to information would know. There's no way not to know that those are lies. I mean, how can you not know that the election wasn't stolen from Trump, that he was the one? I mean, it's just out there, presented as boldly as anything I've ever seen presented on the public stage. How can you not know that climate change is a major thing? I mean, just the daily news practically with wildfires and all the rest. How can you not know? Well, if you look into the answer to how it is that people can you find that there are systemic forces that are breaking them.
And
You
what
can
are they?
see, well, for example, it can be a cultural thing. First of all, you can be brought up in a family in which there are lies that the children are compelled to believe. Nobody's allowed to know that daddy is molesting his daughter, or nobody's allowed to know that the daddy's an alcoholic. Whatever the family secrets are, you can be brought up being compelled to believe a lie. That's the brokenness in that family. And you could ask, well, how did he get to be that kind of a guy? That also is going to be a product of history. And then there's cultural things. Like I live in Dixie, as do you, by the way. I live in the land of the Confederacy. And it is a land in which lies have been told. If you look into the history of how the Civil War was taught in the South, you find that the powers of the state were used to compel teachers to teach lies about the Civil War. So people grew up, and it goes back before the Civil War too, but just looking at the lost cause lie, the war of northern aggression lie, the states' rights lie. It emerged right after the Civil War. It's been sold to generations of Southerners who have made a hero of Jefferson Davis, who led his region into an utter disaster. It's saturated with lies, and people are brought up from the beginning in the culture to be able to absorb certain kinds of lies from certain kinds of authorities. Anyway, The world is broken. It makes people broken. Then broken people forward the force of brokenness and so we are dealing with 10,000 years of a force of brokenness working in countless ways, permeating every level from the individual psyche to family structure, to social structure, to power structures, to the international system.
Now, everything that you've just said there, if you take a listen to it, back to the article that we're discussing here with regards to human nature, I think a lot of what you're saying is, and I think your experiment as well that you're about to talk about is going to prove that. And I think it's something that I've always agreed with, that while there is in fact human nature, much of what occurs has less to do with human nature, because all the brokenness that you talk about, all these issues that you speak about with people wanting to believe fallacies or people having learned fallacies from their inception, from their birth, actually says that a lot of this quote unquote brokenness, a lot of this belief system, it's the external that's causing it and not the nature that's causing it. Do I read you right?
Yeah, we live in an unnatural world.
Right.
Which is not, it's partly to be understood as this is what people wanted, like, I've got a soft chair over there, that's what I wanted. I got hot and cold running water over there. That's what I wanted. Part of it is people meeting their needs. But part of it is this other systemic force driving things in ways that nobody has been in a position to control. And so I think that people don't often think about how the whole can be something other than the sum of its parts.
Mm-hmm.
They think that if human beings have been acting for 10,000 years, then whatever comes out of it has got to be an expression of what human beings are. But that's not really, that does not follow. I mean, it does not follow because people can plunge into a situation like we did that has a dynamic of its own.
But I think if we expand on that, we just take a look at how far we've come with things like changing the past belief on women's rights, the rights of gay marriage, and all these things. When you think about where we've been and where we've gone, I think that probably makes your case as well. Now, you have an experiment that you mentioned in the article that actually I think is probably one of the better experiments that just shows, yes, there is human nature, or there is nature, if you will. But again, externalities play a part. Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, the point's going to be that for species like us, we're born incomplete because and we're not the only ones, but we're
what do you mean by we were born incomplete?
Well, what I mean is we're born, for example, with the innate capacity, which is quite extraordinary, just us human beings. We're going to learn a language. But what language we're going to learn, that depends on where we get born, You and I speak English, though you're bilingual in a way that I'm not. But we if we'd been born at a different time and place, we could be speaking, ancient Greek, or we could be speaking Mandarin Chinese, and that stands for all kinds of things. But even the rhesus monkey, who's not going to be learning a language and a culture as complex as what we humans do. The study took a bunch of rhesus monkey infants and divided them into two groups. One group, and each one was growing up separately with this phony mother. One group had a phony mother that consisted only of wire mesh. The other group had the same thing, except that it had a piece of terry cloth around it, which turned out to be important because the rhesus monkey is born needing something to cuddle up to. And that's fine in all the situations that rhesus monkeys are born in, probably, virtually, they're going to have a mother who's there taking an interest in them and letting them cuddle up against them. So the nature of the child is there when it's born, needing something to cuddle up with. But if it doesn't get that, like with the group of infants that get just the wire mesh, they develop into something really messed up. They are incapable of functioning in rhesus monkey society, and they're social animals. They're incapable of mating. They are completely messed up because they were born with a nature that required cultures, required the environment to provide something to complete them properly. And except for the unnatural thing that the scientist, who would never be allowed to do this experiment nowadays, the scientist created this unnatural situation, which resulted in messing up the creature so much that it could hardly, that's not rhesus nature. What you see with those rhesus monkeys raised in those unnatural situations, we would never think that that's rhesus nature. It's the other ones who had the terry cloth and who managed to develop into a fairly normal functioning adult monkeys.
Right.
That's rhesus nature. So that unnatural environment, the wire mesh mother, is at least somewhat analogous to the civilized societies that we human beings have been compelled to live in. They are unnatural in ways that are not a function of how to complete us. They have been in many ways hostile to human nature, because the whole, and this is going back to the idea that we've gone into before, the necessity has been that what survives is what can prevail in a war of all against all. What survives is essentially the spirit of the warlord, which is what emerges out of the anarchy that the step into civilization inevitably creates. So we get the unnatural environment. I don't know how much of it you could say that we have around us today. I think we're doing better than humanity generally has. How much of it is wire mesh mother that twists and breaks us? But we do know that when civilization first emerged, fully bloomed in cities and empires, what we see is indeed the spirit of the gangster having a disproportionate say in how the human world gets run. We see tyrants. We see the majority of people living lives of slaves. This is not what human beings would have chosen. This is the unnatural environment.
So here's a question, and this is what, I it's one that I want answered. I think it's one that we seek the answer for over and over again, and I think if we find the right answer to this, we may be successful.
Do you think I'm going to be able to answer it?
I think you should know the answer.
Okay.
I don't know. Let's see.
All right,
but
suck it to me.
Here's the thing, Doc. My contention is that most people are good, and I see that. I work with that. I talk to people of all stripes, and I can tell you, deep in my heart, this is not a cliche. Most people are good, and most actually want to do good. But also, what you talk about a lot, the externalities that come into people's minds, everything that you talk about, the spirit of the gangster, being able to control the people, all of that is what I see. I look at the gangsters in our society, and the gangsters aren't only the Donald Trumps. In fact, Donald Trump himself has his own gangster, in my opinion, which is the system above him. But they are able, a small quantity of them are able to penetrate the good people. And I'm not only talking about what they learn, but it's just on how they act and the things that they do and what they consider normal. What do you think, first of all, is the proper way to define that And secondly, how do we get to people to neutralize the bad gangster and become a good gangster?
Well, I
Or
I
let me back up.
oh, okay.
I said that wrong. How can we change from the bad gangster to make them see us as gangsters for good?
Well, I wouldn't. I would never use a phrase like "gangsters for good," but
Well, you get the analogy I'm trying to make.
well, yeah. So you say all most people are good, and
Yes.
I see a lot of truth in that. But I do have to confess that I've struggled for over 50 years to get a clear idea of what is our human nature. And I really don't. I don't know how good it is. I feel like I can prove that it's better than we have been taught to think it is. And I'm aware of a lot of research which indicates that things like compassion, um, a
Empathy.
sense, empathy, a sense of fairness, do seem to be built into us. I also think that you know the fostering of human goodness is also a challenge. I mean, just like a culture can work to make people broken, I think that real wholeness is an achievement, not just a birthright. I think that when people are just sort of naturally who they are, you can see the selfishness that there is in a toddler or something like that. And, there's a lot of stuff in us, and it's not all. It's not all to create the world in which there's peace on earth and goodwill toward men. Uh, I think that the teachings of our religions are aspirations that would be challenging to meet, even if we didn't have to deal with these systemic forces of brokenness. So, but I don't know exactly where we'd end up if we didn't have systemic forces to work with. It would still, I think, be a project to build a really whole world in which people are really good to each other, and people are able to achieve their maximal fulfillment. That being said, it is important to realize, and I think you said that in our next conversation, we're going to talk about a piece about the utter selfishness of three
Wreckage.
major
Yeah. The
figures.
wreckage.
Yeah, the incredible selfishness of three people who are playing a very impactful role in our world, especially Putin and Trump are the two. But I throw in Israel's Netanyahu, whose selfishness blows my mind, and whose selfishness is in the process of destroying his country. So I threw that in, and the question is that you raise, I would pose as, how do we create a world in which people who are so extraordinarily broken in that way don't play such a disproportionate role in human affairs? I mean, Putin by himself has changed the whole dynamic of the planet. The piece of Europe that took him 70 some years to build, he's broken it. Just one man made that decision. How do we create a world in which somebody like that cannot become the sole voice deciding what a nation with a massive nuclear arsenal will do on the planet? So that's, one level of saying what the challenge is. And another level of it is, something's gone wrong in this country at the level of consciousness. If you've got a major American political party that would have the relationship with a would-be tyrant like Donald Trump that the base had in 2015-16 to make him the nominee, that the party has had to acquit him when he was the most impeachable president we could imagine, and that continues to follow him even after he's essentially tried to overthrow the constitutional order. He didn't create the circumstances in which such a thing could happen. How do we heal what's gone wrong in the minds of tens of millions of people?
And that's a question, how do we do it?
Well, I often come up with a metaphor. It's not the great metaphor, but I often come up with it. Yeah, I don't buy meat. I don't cook meat. But my mom used to make a pot roast, and she made a delicious pot roast. And I remember the way a good piece of chuck roast would be marbled with fat. So there's real meat, and then there's the fat to bring out the flavor, and ideally, well, it's the world we live in is that chuck roast, and the fat is all the dimensions of brokenness that there are at every level of the society, from people's being taught to hate the animal that we also are, all the things that happen in our world that are broken at every level, the injustices, the prejudices, the paranoias, all of it needs to be dealt with. It's all it all feeds itself. So if you look at the force of fascism in America today, you can see the tributaries to them are all the dimensions of American brokenness that we've seen over the centuries.
So then do we fix it?
The racism, the corporate greed, they're all aligned, sort of showing these are all the rivers that are feeding in, that are now in a position to threaten the very survival of American democracy. And we've had all these rivers all along, but they have combined in a way.
Dr. Schmookler, good problem talking about the issue, etc. And we're running close on time here. So I'm going to ask you one thing to when we talk about the wreckedness that we spoke about before.
The whatness?
I think we called it, I don't have your email right now. The next subject that we're talking about, wrecked,
the wreckage.
Wreckage.
The wreckage that utter
what did I say?
wreaks upon the world.
Right. That's what
I like wreaking wreckage.
There we go. Yeah, I know you would have some sort of alliteration or something with that, but here is what I'd like to do, because I want you to give a closer here. But for the next talk that we're going to do, I would like to and maybe we talk about the wreckage completely first, and then for our audience, what we start to do is talk about solutions that we think with the people out there trying to answer questions and trying to make a better America, a better world. What kind of input can a Dr. Schmookler give that says, this is something that we would like to add to your repertoire to help solve these problems that we discuss here? I always like to have not only describing problems, but hopefully having solutions. So in the last minute, why don't you give me a closer for this segment?
Wow. I hope you feel okay about the way I'm going to do that, because I feel like I've had two big ideas in my life. One of them's got to do with that social evolutionary force that makes us into broken rhesus monkeys in part. But the other one has to do with an understanding that at the center of the human battle is something that can be seen as a conflict between two coherent forces. There's a coherent force that consistently works to make things more broken. and there's a coherent force that consistently works to make things more whole. And I define good and evil in those terms. And then I try to show how there are these coherent forces. And it's got to do with that marbling that what we're engaged in is the battle between good and evil. And it turns out that there is a reality in the human world that is reasonable to describe that way, but you can get rid of those words if you don't like them, and you can say a battle between a force of wholeness and a force of brokenness, and then I can show you how there are those coherent forces. And so I think that what we should see is that basically the political situation in America today, and I know you are very devoted to that important dimension, as am I, that political battle, and I've been trying to say this for 20 years, that we really should see it in terms of the battle between good and evil, not in some simple-minded way, but this is the nature of how politics has become in America. I grew up in a different kind of America. Then it was a matter of conservative versus liberal, and they would battle, and the elements of good and evil were sort of mixed in both camps, and they would fight over things like tax rates and various policy issues, and all kinds of things would enter into it in terms of values and principles. And neither side was just the good guy on every situation. Neither side was the bad guy on every situation. It was a mixture, but that's not what it is now. And even in the political realm, what we're dealing with is not just the political battle. We also, if we want to heal America, have to heal the nature of the consciousness that has been exploited by this force, that has appealed to the worst of them, gotten them to believe the unbelievable, got them to defend the indefensible.
And that is where we end it, Dr. Schmookler. Thank you so kindly once again. We've been listening to Dr. Andy Bard Schmookler, who writes a whole lot as well on these issues, and we're happy to have had you on Politics Done Right.
Well, thank you for having me. Nice to be back.
We spend a lot of time deconstructing the news, trying to parse it into a form that everybody can understand. We try to find those little nitpicks where it flies above the fray, etc. If you really like these videos that we do, I want to ask a big favor. Please go ahead, number one, subscribe to our channel, and number two, please join if you can. Thank you so kindly for watching. Keep watching. Please remember to share. We must populate the entire internet with our progressive message, a message that we know is what most Americans say that they want. So help us, please join.